So today we are able to invite Dr. Sheng from the School of Communication at Hong Kong Public University. Dr. Zhou is currently working as an assistant professor at the school's journalism department. And he received his PhD degree from Stanford University, a very renowned university. And his research interest, according to his website, is an interdisciplinary media research interest. Spans such areas as critical theory, political aesthetics, digital media and society, culture industries, and global communication. Very impressive research background. Okay, so today we will focus particularly on one of Dr. Zhou's recent research. Recently published research, I would say. It's entitled Restyling Propaganda, Popularized Party Press and the Making of Softer Propaganda in China. So, hello, Dr. Zhou. Welcome, and it's such an honor to be able to invite you.
Hello, Dr. Huang. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
Could you please briefly introduce the study we mentioned and we are going to study today? For example, what motivated you to conduct a study on softer propaganda in the state-owned media in China?
Yeah. Thank you. It really started off as my dissertation research project. I remember that was probably in my third year of PhD program, and I think around 2016, I started to receive some videos from my friends in the United States who are also Chinese, animated explainer videos made by state-run media in China usually about government initiatives or policies which incorporated some popular cultural elements like hip hop or animation or cartoons and stuff like that. And I found it very intriguing, and I started to see more and more, and I started to notice those state-run outlets, social media practices on their social media accounts, like Weibo and WeChat. At the time, these were two major channels. Of course, they also have their own apps, but I would say those two platforms are probably more popularly used by all kinds of people. So I started to probe into this phenomenon, and because I thought it was pretty widespread, so I started to establish links with people who were working in state-run media at the time, and I started to do interviews, semi-structured, in-depth interviews with those people, and most of whom were actually making similar kind of campaigns, what I end up calling soft propaganda campaigns or edutainment campaigns in three major state-run outlets. So I started to gather more and more data to figure out the production of such campaigns, not necessarily the reception, but it's more production oriented. I'll focus more on the production side through like some sort of organizational sociology perspective or media sociology perspective. But in particular, I focus on the field dynamics, the inter and intra-organizational dynamics, the motivations at those levels that drive that kind of production. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing this apart. I have a follow-up question. It's more about methodology or your access particularly, because we all know, and also in your paper you mentioned it's quite challenging to be able to access, especially to the state-owned media.
Yeah.
How did you gain the access? You mentioned you conduct interviews, you try to do snowboard, but could you explain more or bring more insight about access to medias? Yeah.
Actually, in my dissertation, I have a methodology section or even chapter that provided more detail, but I can be really briefly introducing some of the methodological details here. So I initially tried different kinds of methods. So in the United States, it was kind of a norm to have like a open recruitment process where you have a recruitment message, you put it out, and then you ask people to contact you. I tried that. I tried to post it on some open platforms and also in WeChat groups, but it ended up not getting me a lot of potential respondents. And I started to start from acquaintances and my friends working in those media outlets, and then ask them to refer potential respondents. And after I secure, for example, a couple, I will ask those to refer me more. So that's like snowball kind of recruitment. Because I think in China, it's a different kind of research environment, and they have different kinds of understandings of risks. And also, we often talk about China as a guanxi society. I think guanxi also affects your recruitment of respondents a lot. And somehow guanxi or closeness or stronger ties will help you to establish the kind of trust or confidence or kind of rapport with your potential respondents sooner, right? So I think snowball recruitment works better in my case. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Another question is about, you mentioned about report. When you did the interviews, were you worried, or did you have this kind of concern that your interviewees would say something that they wouldn't do just because of you? You're Chinese, but you were based in the US. Did you have this kind of concern, and how did you conquer the challenge?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So we as researchers, we want to get the most authentic kind of answers, right? We don't want to ask leading questions or questions that will potentially bias their answers. So as researchers, we have to recruit as many as possible to reach saturation as like an interviewer or ethnographer. And also we need to find ways to sort of tell whether that respondent is giving you genuine answers based on nonverbal cues and based on triangulation of different people's responses. I was worried initially, but I was surprised how like willing they were to share with you factual based information, and also real practices happening, or their real opinions and concerns, some of which might sound a little bit contrary to the organization's values. Well, they're very outspoken. They're very open to voice their disagreement with their organization and share with me some interesting opinions. So also, I think most of the data end up really useful for me. So it turned out to be working quite well. Yeah.
Yeah, from your paper, we can see the data or the finding part is really very insightful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I have to add that initially I already promised them that all the data will be anonymized. They're disidentified, and also they will only be used for the purpose of research. They won't appear on any public platforms. So they're only used for publication, for research purpose. So they all know that. So I didn't use any of their real names. I didn't even use their institutions' names. You can see I invented code names for all those media outlets. So I think this gives them a sense of kind of security or reassurance. Yeah.
That's quite important, actually, in terms of research ethics. Could you share a little bit more on the coding process? Because as we all know, doing qualitative research is actually what I would say big data. Because the traditional sense or the classic sense of big data means quantity is big. The data's quantity is big. But I think for qualitative research, the dimension, the directions of data are very big.
Yes.
So how come you are able to summarize 4 themes in your paper finding part? How did you do that? How were you able to do that? How long did it take for you to code the multi-directions data?
Yeah, indeed. I think this is a very good question. And I also want to echo your observation that we're not working with very small amount of data. I mean, I did 20 interviews, and that each interview actually most of them lasted for 1.5 hours or 2 hours. So I think that's a lot of data, and I ended up with a lot of transcript, and I have to go through them again and again. Really, it was a lot of data, but I think I really just coded it according to the the kind of grounded theory approach, constant comparison, and try to identify first open codes and then axial codes and then selective coding. In selective coding, you have to through this process, you have to identify the broader patterns and the broader themes that always recur, that they're not just unique to one interview, but you see it in multiple interviews. Then you started to think, oh, this is actually pretty common practice there. And also you sort of related to your conceptual framework, because not all the themes are relevant to your research questions and your conceptual framework. And you have to constantly remind yourself what you want to study, what are the key research questions that you want to focus on. So I want to focus on their routines, their values, and their practices, usually related to how digitization are reshaping existing or sometimes enhancing or sometimes undermining existing practices or values. You have to always relate the themes to that kind of set of main questions in your conceptual framework and try to tease out the most important themes. So I ended up with 4, and I think those are the 4 most prominent, most frequently occurring themes across multiple interviews. Yeah, so that's a bit about the process of coding.
Thank you. That's very useful and insightful for our audience, I think. So every research or every researcher, they will use something we call theoretical framework. So except for the key concept of propaganda, I noticed that you mentioned or you used produce a field theory in the paper. Could you elaborate a little bit more on why or how come you chose produce work in terms of analyzing data?
Yeah, field theory actually has been used quite a lot by sociologists and scholars who are studying media production, news production, especially from a kind of organizational kind of perspective. And they But a lot of the English literature using field theory on media, as you are well aware, focus on Western media. And when you study Chinese media with similar theories, you will necessarily have to extend them or sort of tweak them somehow. When I was doing interviews, I find this theoretical framework very useful, but also see very unique kind of dynamics. For example, when you're approaching state-run media in China, you see that they're straddling different fields, really, political field, journalistic field, and you see how they will have to respond to and negotiate with forces in those fields, and how they will have to present their agendas differently according to different forces in different fields, and the different fields have different structures and different poles. For example, in the traditional Bourdieuian field theory, it focuses mainly on the economic and cultural poles. But in China, you have to foreground or highlight the political force that are also shaping media production, and the political force does not always go in the same direction as the economic force. So it becomes a different source of pressure, and a very unique source of pressure for media organizations in China. But I think most importantly, the way that I extend field theory is to highlight the use of a term called refraction, which is not often used in prior media research, because they usually focus more on how the media kind of are subject to the pressures and have to respond and have to kind of respond accordingly. But refraction means how media can also kind of appropriate or kind of change the course of, or change the direction of the external influence or pressures for their own purposes, and try to respond it to enhance their own agendas or their own purposes. So I think that is how I approach it differently, and how I extend the theory to study state-run media in China.
Okay. Did you meet any Chinese when you were producing this paper from a Westerner or Western scholars by asking you why did you choose a Western theory to, or why did you extend a Western theory to explain Chinese reality?
Yeah, I think usually, like at the time when I was doing research on media in China, usually they will say, why do you choose to study China, for example, beyond the fact that you're Chinese? But now people seldom ask that question anymore. But at the time, it's like a more Western-centric kind of environment. Now there have been more diversifying efforts, I think. So at the time, you have to justify the choice of your research site, for example. And then in terms of theory, I didn't get a lot of challenges on why I chose field theory, maybe because it was already kind of established theory in that area. But yes, they would want to know whether you're extending it in the right way, and how do you justify why you want to creatively and critically extend it, and whether it's used in the right way. So you have to like get deep into the literature and then tell them how the Chinese site differs from other Western sites, and what are the unique characteristics of the Chinese media field. And then you have to engage with the literature, but also try to change it according to what's happening on the ground in China. Yeah.
Okay. Besides the challenge of access and probably the theoretical framework, what would you say other challenge you met while you were studying this topic?
I think another challenge in terms of theorizing is that you have to really kind of combine different literature, different sources, and different approaches from across disciplines, right? Not just the but you have to also try to draw from other disciplines. And I think the challenge is how do you combine them in a fruitful way? As an interdisciplinary scholar, I always have to think about ways to like engage with different kind of thoughts and traditions. So I think that that requires some sort of thinking and effort. And in addition to that, I think another thing is to think about the broader contribution of this piece, right? How can this inform a theorization of, for example, the production of propaganda, contribute to the larger propaganda studies, or studies of digital media and society, because it's very hard to be original given that a lot of similar research has been produced, and you have to think about what's unique about this project and how do you sort of pitch this uniqueness to different audiences. Yeah.
The last question about this particular piece, what would you say are the future directions of research in the area of soft propaganda in China?
Yeah, this becomes an increasingly important topic, and because my project was conducted before COVID pandemic, and now you can see more research focusing on the pandemic era, especially visual propaganda that can be digital or non-digital, and on multiple platforms. Because when I was doing my dissertation project, I think the major platforms of focus were still WeChat and Weibo. But now you can see their presence on Douyin. You can see their presence on Bilibili. At the time when I asked about their practices on Bilibili, most of the people were still saying either they haven't tried or they tried but with limited effect or impact, and they sort of gave up. But then you can see there more and more experiments with different kind of platforms over the years after my project was completed. So that was a trend, which is the multi-platform practices, and more platforms. More and more platforms, you are able to see similar campaigns. And then also in terms of their strategy, they will have to keep up with what's popular and what's relevant. So you will see more and more styles, formats being used. So those are going to be the trend, I think, in this specific area of soft propaganda, digital soft propaganda, I think.
Okay. So soft propaganda or propaganda is not a unique thing owning to Chinese societies.
Yes. Yeah.
It's a global thing. It's a global phenomena. What would you say that is or are the distinctive features of Chinese society in terms of soft propaganda or propaganda?
Yeah, I think in China, for example, you have a very centralized propaganda system. So you can see a lot of like homogenizing narratives or similar narratives across multiple platforms sort of being circulated by different kinds of media. I think centralization is phenomenal, and it's quite unique. And in typical like Western countries, usually you have different kinds of actors and different parties circulating different kind of narratives or oppositional or contradictory narratives, and different actors, not only like parties can do propaganda, in different kind of ideological groups can also do that. And you don't quite see that in China, but you see it in many democratic societies. So I think that could be another difference in terms of the diversity of or variety of actors. Yeah.
Because you also mentioned about the emotional
governance.
Yes, emotional governance in your paper. Would you say that's one of the distinctive feature of Chinese soft propaganda, because they focus more on emotional governance, sometimes at the expense of maybe capital or financial income?
Yeah, the positive energy element is very unique. And also state media, all kinds of media, and government organs, when they're doing public communications, they emphasize morality a lot. And they always assert moral leadership, and this is also very important. So emotional governance, they govern emotions, they also govern morality. It has to be more morally correct. Not only politically correct, but also morally. So I think that's also very important. So you see celebrities can be banned, and shows can be taken down due to their ideological orientations or moral orientations. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So besides students, also young scholars or junior scholars may see this video. So we want to jump out of this particular research, but focus more on your own career or academic development. So we want to ask you several questions about yourself and your self-development. So first question about yourself is reflecting your career. What would you say are the most challenging factors that you encounter so far?
Yeah. The most challenging factor, I think, is something that you can also relate to as a qualitative scholar. So I did my PhD at Stanford, and even at Stanford, I think Stanford was a quite interdisciplinary program, but at Stanford program, people like me who are doing qualitative research, and also I'm doing critical cultural research, is the absolute minority. We have very, very few people doing that at Stanford, and very, very few international students doing that. I have to emphasize that. And I entered that program without even a degree in the United States. This was also kind of rare, very, very rare. So you have to, as Chinese students, as international students, you're doing critical cultural research there, you have to overcome a lot of barriers in terms of like, not only language, but also culture, and also the theory learning process can be arduous, and you have to read a lot in your non-native language. And that is a very difficult process that people tend to neglect. And it's very hard training process, and it's also the job prospect is also concerning. So I think people should be aware of this when they're entering PhD training, PhD program. But regardless, you should still be faithful to what you want to do and what you're passionate about. I didn't regret doing qualitative research or critical research at all. I just want to remind people of that kind of challenges, but I'm very convinced, and I have a lot of conviction in what I'm doing. I think it's interesting and relevant research, and I will keep doing that. But those are the challenges, and also the kind of Western-centric orientation. I mentioned before, there have been more and more kind of diversification initiatives, but still not enough. And I think still it's pretty, the field is pretty dominated by Western scholars and traditions and theories. So one of the big challenge for Chinese students and Chinese scholars is how to create our own theories. And when we study Chinese media, it should not be just another case study in a different country. It should not be a replication of existing Western theory in just a non-Western site. How do we make sure that the knowledge that were produced here in China and about China can then inform a genuinely global theorization of media and culture? And like, how can we have that kind of theory dialogue with the hegemonic discourse and also reform the hegemonic discourse from within? I think that's a big challenge. And I have to say that's the big challenge, and that's a responsibility for new and junior students and scholars in this field.
Your answer actually reflects how excellent you are.
Thank you.
How did you find your research area ideas or inspirations? Because when I first entered my PhD, the first year of my PhD study, my supervisor actually asked me, why did you want to study journalist? That was my initial research interest. I wanted to study Chinese journalists and their everyday life. So when he asked me about that, and he also asked me, why did you want to become a scholar, or why did you choose to do PhD? My answer was very naive. I said, because I wanted to change the world.
Wow.
That's and then he was very surprised, and then he said, probably you should reconsider your motivation. So what about you, and how did you find your research interest?
Yeah, I think my answer will be like a more mundane one, and not as noble as changing the world to begin with, because I started on my training in communication because I was just fascinated by research in media and culture and critical cultural studies, media cultural studies, because they can approach everyday phenomena in really creative and thoughtful and really profound ways, and they can see bigger patterns out of really small incidents and occurrences that we tend to take for granted. I think that's just phenomenal. That kind of level of theorization is just fascinating, and they can inform broader discussions about politics, culture, and the questions concerning society and concerning social interactions. So I think they're very relevant to our everyday life. They're not just like abstract things that are somehow detached or remote from everyday happenings. So that's like why I'm so interested in because it's so closely related to everyday life. So I think that's kind of, but yeah, your question about how do I find inspiration for my research, I think this is a good one. I think it really comes from my everyday observations and something that I really feel passionate about, and I want to write about, and I want to invite more discussions or debate on. So usually it's something that comes directly from my life, like the soft propaganda campaign, for example. It comes from my experiences with those kind of artifacts across platforms. So I usually had some ideas about what's interesting and what's personally relevant, but also academically like important, then I would start working on that. And I think as a PhD student, I usually had too many ideas that I have to narrow down. But now I think the struggle is, now as a junior scholar, you have to pressure for publication. You cannot write about everything, and you have to like more strategic about what you approach.
Yeah.
And the feasibility kind of element is very important. You always gauge the feasibility of a potential project, whether it's doable and how much time you will have to spend and how much time it will take before you reach results. You get it published. This will all be important concerns for me. But as a student back then, I didn't have those concerns. It was like pretty free, and I can write about anything I want. My advisor was super supportive. He always said, just do whatever you want to do and write about anything you want to write about and read anything. Don't just read comm literature and comm scholarship, just read whatever literature that is relevant. That was really great mentorship, and that's why I learned so much, I think, during the PhD program. Yeah.
I definitely can echo your your challenge about being a junior scholar. We're under a lot of pressure of getting published.
Yes.
Speaking of which, would you say you still care about work-life balance, or do you believe the idea of work-life balance?
I still want to believe in the idea of work-life balance. I think you have to think about what's the motivation for you to be a scholar. If you or a PhD student or graduate student, right? And do not forget about the kind of initial passion that motivated you, 就是往出苏醒, right? Because that's very important. And to be honest, like being an academic is not the most high-paying jobs that you can get. It doesn't give you that kind of satisfaction that you can not otherwise derive from other professions. What's the point of staying here? I think for me, the only reason to stay is because I believe in doing interesting research and important research and sort of inspiring others to do this kind of research and kind of informing my students and teach my students how to see the world from different perspectives and how to inquire about an issue that matters to you and matters to people around you. I think that's the motivation. So I think as long as you are doing that, it should be fine. You shouldn't be too worried about external factors. Ideally, of course, but you should feel happy. So work-life balance is key to having a happy life. I'm still learning how to do it. But I think the most important thing is that you shouldn't be ashamed that you're not productive enough or not efficient enough. It's okay to be not as productive as many of your colleagues. It's okay to want to spend some time not doing work. I think I'm trying to tell me that a lot of the times. That's what I'm still learning to do.
Oh, definitely. When I was doing my PhD research as a PhD student, I feel freer, but currently I feel oh, I have to publish. So that's kind of a cultural challenge that all have to face. But definitely you have more insight in terms of handling this. You mentioned you're still learning, but yeah. Okay, so the last question, you actually mentioned in previous answers about your suggestion to junior scholars and Chinese scholars. But in terms of career development, what would you suggest to them to do? Or do you have any suggestions about career development for junior researcher or PhD, particularly PhD students?
Well, I will just try my best to answer this question. I don't think I'm the best person to answer that question, but I think because now I think the bar of getting a good sort of early career job is higher and higher, and so you have to, I think, explore opportunities to collaborate in order to get more publications. And another advice is to be more interdisciplinary, which means that you should take more classes and engage with the literature and collaborate with scholars from other areas or disciplines. And also, I think you have to think about your research program and what can give you that kind of academic identity and what can really set you apart from other scholars, and what's your unique contribution to the field as an early career academic, and to think more broadly about what you want to achieve. So think about the long-term plan. I think those are the kind of suggestions that I can come up with right now. Yeah,
I definitely agree with you. Vision is quite important. A lot of our junior PhD students, they only focus on ICA, IAMCR, those kind of short-term achievements. But as you mentioned, long-term achievement, long-term vision is also quite important, especially for them to develop themselves and as a scholar. Okay, so we've taken too much of your time, and we learned a lot from you. Thank you very much, Dr. Zhou. So that's for today.
Thank you, Dr. Huang.
We hope we can communicate more in the future. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.